Welcome to the April 15th, 2024 meeting of Troy Council. We ask that you please silence your cell phones during their meeting. Please stand for the invocation and the Pledge of Allegiance. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for all the graces that you have bestowed on our city. We are thankful for the community's successful events, today's wonderful weather, the renewed positive attitudes and spirit that comes with springtime. We ask you to continue to guide this body in the work and requests that are presented to them in order, in order to maintain the benefits and treasures Troy experiences. Continue to guide us in our deliberations as we work to benefit all citizens of Troy. All these things we ask in your name. Amen. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist. Mr. Twist.
Here.
Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce.
Present.
Mr. Whidden.
Here.
Mrs. Marshall. Here. Mr. Schilling.
Present.
Mrs. Westfall. Here. Mrs. Sneed. Here. Mr. Siebert.
Here.
Motion to excuse Mr. Twist.
Second. Motion to excuse Mr. Twist by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Pierce.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall. Yes. Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall. Yes. Mrs. Sneed. Yes. Mr. Siebert.
Yes.
Mr. Twist is excused.
That brings us to, we have a Rumpke Quarterly Presentation Award by the Mayor and the Rumpke representatives.
Good evening. You too, yes, you're here. Well, congratulations, and good evening, everyone. My name's Shonda, and I'm the Municipal and Public Sector Rep for Rumpke and manage the contract, curbside recycling contract. And we're proud to partner with the city to provide that service to residents. And we thank you for participating and being great environmental stewards. So thank you to Mr. and Mrs. Jackson. And I just want to read their answer to the quarterly survey. When asked, why do you recycle, they answered, we love helping to reduce waste products so that future generations will get to enjoy the community we've come to love. So thank you so much. And again, we appreciate you. I do have something that we'd like to introduce at Rumpke. I have our communications specialist, Molly Kennedy, here with me tonight, just to give a brief description of some exciting news that we have. So,
a couple of presentations. So if you guys want to learn a little bit more about Hefty, I can pass them around. So yes, so Rumpke has partnered with Hefty, the garbage bag people. And so what is this Hefty Renew program? So this Hefty Renew program is to help with recycling. So we are now recycling hard to recycle plastics, basically. Items such as packing peanuts, your frozen food bags, different things like that that typically we cannot recycle, items that we do not take. So what you do is you'll go to your local Kroger or Meijer or Ace Hardware or Walmart, and you buy a box of 20 bags for $8. It is a little bit more expensive, but these bags typically last about a month to fill up because you're putting items such as that are very lightweight items, so you can pack a lot in there. I know I gave my dad a bag, and he's like, I have a 60-inch TV box full of packing peanuts. Can I get all of these in here? I said, yep, absolutely you can. Turns out he could not. We tried really hard. We were very close, but unfortunately we couldn't get them all in there. But that is the nice thing about these bags. They are very durable. They stretch. You can fill them up pretty packed fully, but they're lightweight. So when you do toss it in your recycling can, it's basically like nothing, but believe me, it'll go a long way. So what you do is you'll go and you'll buy these bags. It is a pay-to-play option. You do not have to participate if you don't want to. That's one thing we like to stress. It is not a requirement. If you have recycling, you do not have to do this if you don't want to. But we recommend it because it's just one additional thing that you can recycle now. So you'll buy these bags. You fill it up. A month later, you throw it in with your recycling in your recycling cart or next to it if you can't fit it into your cart. Our drivers will pick it up. We take it to our MRF, and then our laborers typically will pull it off of the track, and then we bail it. We take it out to Cincinnati, and then Hefty comes and picks it up, and they turn it into PVC piping. I'm trying to think of the other things that we've... Park benches, drainage materials, and sustainable building materials. So it replaces those items that are typically not reusable items. I do have a building block. It's about 30 pounds. It's very heavy, but it is dense because these items are compacted so tightly because they're lightweight items. So it takes a while for it to add up and to actually do something, but it is in the process, and it actually does turn into something very, very cool that can be used. So who uses this? Anybody that wants to. We have started this in Cincinnati in, I want to say, October, November timeframe. Stores could not keep it on the shelf. I know Kroger was constantly calling us, asking for more bags because they couldn't keep it on the shelves. They didn't know what to do. So hopefully here in Dayton we'll be able to get ahead of that. That's currently the situation we're in. So we started out with starter kits back in the middle of March, and people can now find these bags on store shelves as of a couple days ago. About a week ago, they were on store shelves. So hopefully you guys can find them here in Miami County. That's pretty much it. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Styrofoam.
Styrofoam does count as one of the items that you can put in this.
Okay, so all of the packing peanuts that you described, which is different from styrofoam, and all of that stuff is acceptable?
Yes, because it is just the material that it's made out of. Yeah, it'll break and everything, but that's what's to be expected. So pretty much what happens is once you close the bag, it's closed, it's done. That bag will be compacted. This bag is durable enough that when it goes into the back of our trucks and our trucks compact everything, it will last. It will not break. We've seen it go through the system. Cincinnati has proven that they actually do work, and they're durable. You know, the Hefty bag, the whole Hefty actually comes true with these bags. Mm-hmm.
Mayor.
You mentioned you'll take it to your MRF.
Yes.
What is a MRF?
Sorry. That is our material recovery facility. So all of our recyclable materials go to a MRF, material recovery facility. The one we have in Dayton is more of a transfer facility. We take the bigger items, but a majority of our recyclable stuff goes down to the big facility down in Cincinnati. Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
Cool. Well, I do have starter kits. I will leave them in the back if anybody is interested. It has a bag and extra information in it as well. So.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Cool.
Mrs. Knight, could you please read the summary of the minutes of April 1st, 2024 meeting?
Minutes of Council, April 1, 2024. Committee reports. Buildings and Utilities Committee recommended that legislation be prepared authorizing bidding for 2 roof projects. Community Partnerships Committee recommended legislation be prepared to provide an agreement for the Troy Strawberry Festival and the expansion of the Dora during the festival. Personnel Committee reported regarding appointments to the Income Tax Board of Review, and Council approved the appointments of Richard Coltice and Thomas Kendall. Resolution number R15, 2024, contract for City Hall roof recoding project, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R16, 2024, repair the roof at the Central Maintenance and Service Facility, was given first reading and adopted. Resolution in memoriam, Robert McCarthy, was approved. Ordinance number 012, 2024, the agreement with Troy Strawberry Festival, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 013, 2024, expanding Dora boundary during Strawberry Festival, first reading and adopted. Following various comments, council adjourned 7:33 p.m.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Motion to approve minutes by Mr. Whidden, second by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
Committee reports. We'll start with Mr. Pierce. You have several tonight, correct?
Let me read my email.
Huh? Oh, it says it. You got them? Okay. Go, Jeff.
You may go, okay.
Yeah.
Let's do the,
Community Economic,
Community and Economic Development Committee reports. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay, let's go. Okay, the first one. This committee met April 8th to review a recommendation from the Troy Planning Commission that the final record plan of Phase 2 of the Villas of Halifax subdivision and patio homes planned development residential, it's a PDR, be approved as it conforms to the approved general plan and final development plan. This PD is located on the east side of North Market Street. The committee supports the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission and recommends that legislation be prepared to approve the final record plan of Phase 2 of the Villas of Halifax subdivision and patio homes planned development, residential PDR. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Pierce, Mrs. Snee, and myself, Jeff Schilling, as chair.
Any questions? Comments? Continue.
Thank you. Okay, on April 8th, this committee met to consider the dedication of a utility easement along North Dorset Road, which the city has requested related to the Addison Landing subdivision. It is a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared accepting the dedication of the utility easement along North Dorset Road related to the Addison Landing subdivision and authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to execute an associated easement documents. Again, respectfully submitted by Mr. Pierce, Mrs. Snee, and myself, Jeff Schilling, as chair.
Questions on any of this? Continue.
Okay, dedication of right-of-way, McCaig Road, replat, 2765 McCaig Road. This committee met on April 8th to consider the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission that council accept the dedication of .124 acres of current in-lot 11365 as right-of-way. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared accepting the dedication of .124 acres of current in-lot 11365 located along 2765 McCaig Road as right-of-way as recommended by the Troy Planning Commission. And again, this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Pierce, Mrs. Snee, and myself, Jeff Schilling, as chair.
Questions, comments? Go ahead.
Okay, last one. Amending professional services agreement with American Structure Point Incorporated to include update to the subdivision regulations. Okay, on April 8th, this committee met to consider an amendment to the professional services agreement with American Structure Point Incorporated to include an update to the subdivision regulations. This will result in the review and update of the comprehensive plan and zoning code and the subdivision regulations by one consultant. It is a recommendation of the committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into an amendment to the professional services agreement with the American Structure Point Incorporated of Indianapolis, Indiana, to provide an update to the subdivision regulations at a cost of $25,000 for a total professional services agreement not to exceed $225,000 so that the work on the subdivision regulations can proceed without delay. Along with the other elements of the agreement, the committee supports emergency legislation. And this was respectfully submitted by Mr. Pierce, Mrs. Snee, and myself, Jeff Schilling, as chair.
Any questions on that report? Thanks, Ms. Schilling. Finance, Mr. Sievert.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. Pierce.
This committee met April 8th to discuss bidding authorization for the curbside recycling program. The current contract expires during the month of May based on recently bid recycling contracts by other political subdivisions and information provided by the current contractor. The cost may increase significantly over the current contract cost. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the curbside recycling program for a 3-year period with up to 2 one-year mutually agreeable extensions at a cost not to exceed $535,000 per contract year, and that the current contract expires in May. Committee supports emergency legislation. Respectfully submitted, Mr. Schilling, Ms. Westfall, and myself as chairman.
Questions? Thank you, Mr. Sievert. Personnel Committee, Mrs. Snee.
Thank you, Mr. President. This committee met April 8th to consider establishing a part-time clerk typist position in the cemetery department. Funds for the position were included in the 2024 budget. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared amending the appropriate salary ordinance to establish the position of clerk typist in the cemetery department, which will be a part-time position with a wage of $22.37 per hour. So that the position can be filled without delay, the committee supports emergency legislation. Respectfully submitted, Mr. Phillips, Mr. Pierce, and myself as chair.
Any questions? Thank you, Mrs. Snee. We have an oral report from the Law and Ordinance Committee regarding a liquor permit. Mr. Whitten.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Ohio Division of Liquor Control has transmitted the notice of the transfer of the existing D1, D2, and D3 liquor permits from the name of Dunaway's Beef and Ale Incorporated, 508 West Main Street, to Deck on Main, LLC, with the same address. The Troy Police Department has not recommended an objection or hearing request be filed.
Questions? Thank you, sir. That brings us to citizens' comments. Anybody in the audience that would like to comment on any of the reports or agenda items tonight, you have a 2-minute limit. Please come to the podium. Give your name and address so Mrs. Knight can record that. And Mr. Kerber is our timekeeper. Seeing none, we will move on to resolutions. Mrs. Knight, could you please read R 17-2024, please?
Resolution number R-17, 2024, resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the curbside recycling program and declaring an emergency. The cost of the program will not exceed $535,000 per year. This will be bid on a 3-year period with up to 2 one-year mutually agreeable extensions. First reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
Motion. Moved to suspend by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Whitten?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Moved to adopt by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Whitten?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, could you please read Resolution 18-2024?
Resolution number R-18, 2024, resolution amending resolution number R-42, 2023, authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an amended professional services agreement with American Structure Point, Inc. of Indianapolis, Indiana, for the update of the comprehensive plan, zoning, coding, and subdivision regulations of the City of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This adds another $25,000 to the initial agreement for a total of $225,000 to include the subdivision regulations. First reading.
Suspend.
Second.
Motion to suspend the readings, Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mrs. Westfall,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, could you read ordinance O-14-2024, please?
Ordinance number 014-2024, ordinance accepting the McCaig Road replat of in-lots 11356 and 11366, and the dedication of right-of-way located along in-lot 11365 in the city of Troy, Ohio. This has been recommended by the Troy Planning Commission. First reading.
Second.
Motion to suspend the readings by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall.
Yes. Move to adopt.
Second.
Motion to adopt ordinance by Mrs. Snee, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Please call the roll, Mrs. Knight.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, would you please read ordinance O-15-2024?
Ordinance number 015-2024, ordinance accepting a utility easement along North Dorset Road, Troy, Ohio, on lot 6895, and authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to execute the easement for utility purposes. This is the first reading. This was actually requested to the city. First reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
Motion to suspend by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes. Move to adopt.
Second. Motion to adopt by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, could you please read ordinance O-16-2024?
Ordinance number 016-2024, ordinance accepting the final record plan of Phase 2 of the Villas of Halifax subdivision and patio homes planned development residential. This has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission. First reading.
Move to suspend.
Motion to suspend by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second. Motion to adopt by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Please call the roll, Mrs. Knight.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance O-17-2024?
Ordinance number 017-2024, Ordinance amending ordinance number 050, 2023, establishing salaries of certain employees in the city of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This establishes the position of a permanent part-time clerk typist in the cemetery department at $22.37 per hour. First reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
Motion to suspend by Mrs. Snee, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Sievert, second by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, could you please read our last ordinance for the evening, 018, 2024?
Ordinance number 018, 2024, an ordinance amending sections 1143.13, 1143.14, 1143.15, 1143.18 of the zoning code of the city of Troy, Ohio. This is related to the downtown riverfront overlay district and specific uses. There is also a moratorium on permits for the DRO at this point. These are the amendments that have been recommended by the Troy Planning Commission. There will be a public hearing at the next meeting.
This will serve as the first reading and it'll go till after that meeting for this next. Thank you very much. Mrs. Knight, are there any communications or announcements?
No, sir.
We have a presentation tonight for the Fair Housing by John Zimmerman, Vice President of Miami Valley Fair Housing Center, and Jacqueline Taylor from the City of Troy. Please come forward.
Good evening. Thank you, President Roswell. My name again is John Zimmerman, and I am glad to be here in Troy. I've been here many times to run the 10K at the Strawberry Festival. I lived for 22 years in Pleasant Hill, and this is just coming back to my home roots. So thanks for having me. I've worked at the Miami Valley Fair Housing Center for 24 years. Next year will be my 25th anniversary, and tonight what I'm going to do is to take you through our mission, and I've broken the mission up to intersperse with it some examples of how we do the work that we do. I want to thank Nikki Reese and Jacqueline Taylor, who are both from the city's Community Development Department, for facilitating my appearance here and for working with me. Earlier this year, we did a presentation at the Senior Citizen Center. We're going to be doing an open house at the local recreation center. And on May 9th, I'm going to be doing a Zoom class for professionals here across Miami County on the Violence Against Women's Act, which was recently reauthorized by Congress. It's reauthorized every 5 years, and every 5 years that they do that, it expands. And so the big thing that they did this year was that Congress ordered HUD to take over the compliance of the Violence Against Women's Act. And since it was reauthorized in March of 2022, HUD has already taken in about 1,000 complaints across the nation against housing providers who are not in compliance with the Violence Against Women Act. So locally, we have already trained about 1,000 professionals, and we're coming to Miami County to do that training because we don't want HUD coming here to nick anyone for noncompliance. And the big thing that we found is that the people that don't know about it are Section 8 landlords. They don't realize that they are subject to the Violence Against Women Act. And when a woman is a victim of domestic violence and they have a Section 8 voucher, their landlord has to allow them several options to get into safety planning, which includes vacating the lease without penalty. And so things like that, unless someone's told, how would you know? And so we're going to do that. So I'm going to get to my written remarks. But again, I really thank Nikki and Jacqueline for setting all of these things up so that we can do our work. And the mission of the Miami Valley Fair Housing Center is to eliminate housing discrimination and ensure equal housing opportunity for all people in our region, the state of Ohio, and nationally. So we're located in Dayton, and some people think that we're the government. We are not. We are a private company, okay? And we are a nonprofit corporation, and we meet the statutory requirements of being a qualified fair housing center. And a qualified fair housing center is one that has demonstrated over years that they bring meritorious complaints to organizations like the Ohio Civil Rights Commission and other, to HUD and places like that who in fact do enforcement. And so we have funding from HUD as a major source of our funding, but we also have funding from Miami County, Montgomery County, the City of Dayton, the City of Kettering, the City of Springfield. We've had funding and contracts with the City of Xenia. So our big footprint locally is in the Dayton metropolitan statistical area, the three-county area, Miami, Greene, and Montgomery County. So specifically, we want to eliminate housing discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, gender, disability, familial status, which means that there are minor children in a household, and any other characteristic that's protected under local or state law. So, for example, Ohio is one of 13 states that protects military status. An important thing, the reason that we want to educate everyone, is that a lot of people confuse our military status with other states like Oregon and Massachusetts. Theirs protects both veterans and people currently in uniformed service, while ours in Ohio only protects those who are currently in uniformed service. And you might see on websites that it protects veterans, but the word veterans not even in the legislation. So it's just those who are currently. So education is a really big thing that we do. We also assist people who are victims of housing discrimination. And recently, we got a call from a client, or from a person who became a client from here in Troy. And they called us and said, my landlord won't allow me to put grab bars in our shower. And so we said, well, tell us all about it. Okay, so we just want to hear. So we listen. And so we find out that they are wanting to do this themselves. Okay, and we found out from them they had never installed a grab bar anywhere in their life. And so we ended up talking with the landlord, who had balked at the idea. The tenant agreed to pay for it like they should, but she was afraid that she would end up with holes in her shower. Well, we were afraid that's what would happen too. So what we did is what HUD tells all fair housing organizations do. Encourage your local residents and housing professionals to get into an interactive dialogue so you can come up with a solution. And so we recommended, we let the landlord know that unfortunately by law, regardless of her fears, she's got to allow this to move forward. People have to be able to add grab bars. That is a fair housing regulation federally and in the state of Ohio. But we also let the tenant know you cannot tear up the landlord's place, so that we recommended that they hire a professional who was bonded, insured, would guarantee the work, people like Grab Bar Man, things like that. And that's because the work, the landlord has to allow the work, but they can insist it be done in a workmanlike manner. So we had no fair housing complaint that we had to file. We were able to just solve the problem in a mediation. And so that's the type of work that we really like to do. So The other part of our mission says that the Miami Valley Fair Housing Center identifies barriers to fair housing in order to help counteract and eliminate discriminatory housing practices. So we found a couple of years ago, there was a bunch of jurisdictions that were saying to us, our human services levy and money that we get from the federal government helps us site housing for adults with developmental disabilities. But we're having a hard time doing that because people might object to it, okay? And some of our zoning laws don't allow that to happen because our zoning law, for example, defines a family as no more than 3 unrelated people living in a household. And what we discovered was that those types of zoning laws are legacy laws that were written before disability was added to fair housing in 1988 to the federal law in 1992 in Ohio. And that some of those zoning laws might, actually violate the 1988 Amendments Act. So we worked with the University of Dayton, and we got some funding from HUD to do this, and we did a study just in Montgomery County, and we discovered that out of the 32 sub-jurisdictions, only 3 were in compliance with the Fair Housing Act. So we wrote a big report, and told each one how they could change their language. And little by little, they would call us, and we would have a meeting with them, and they would adopt different language for defining a family and things like that. And so, again, that's great to have those resources so that we can work as partners with local jurisdictions to clean up anything that is like a legacy law that has been circumvented by a newer law. So that's something that we had, and we have that report on our website. I'm going to tell you about one more situation, and I think it's an important situation because we found this. I will always talk a lot about seniors and people with disabilities because out of 33,000 complaints last year, 60%, or nearly 18,000 of those complaints, were people with disabilities filing complaints. And all the other protected classes combined are the other 40%. And so it is a huge issue. And the 2 issues that come up is 1, design and construction, and 2, people being refused a reasonable accommodation. So we've done a lot of education with different municipal staffs and stuff, and so we had a lady, I was at a meeting about age-friendly cities, and it was down at the Kroc Center in Dayton, and a woman got up and she said, I'm 90 years old, and she says, I really want to thank the city of Dayton for giving me a reasonable accommodation so that, she says, I got hurt last year, and I couldn't get my trash out to the end of my driveway. It has to be there every Monday by 8 o'clock to be picked up. And she said, so I called the city of Dayton and said, gosh, I'm not permanently disabled, but I would really like to get someone to help me, get that trash emptied. And what she didn't know was the law, but she knew that she had a problem and she asked for help. So the law says this, in that situation, the city is obligated to call up the people who pick up the trash and say to them, we have a person with a disability. Because the Fair Housing Act, unlike the Social Security definition of disability, covers both permanent and temporary disabilities. And she said, gosh, I'm only going to need this until my leg gets better. And they said, that's great. So they called up the provider. They were happy to do that. And for 6 weeks, every Monday, someone would come up her driveway because she had her trash container outside of her kitchen door. They would wheel it down, dump it, and bring it up. And then when she was ready for them to stop that, one day she just put a note on it. She wheeled it down herself and said thanks. But the city, knew their fair housing obligation that they had to make that request for an exception, which is a reasonable accommodation. So anyone whose work intersects with housing has to have a policy on reasonable accommodations. So that is something that, that we think is a best practice, and if anybody ever needs guidance on that, that's what the Fair Housing Center is for. People call us up, they say, can you send us a model, do things like that, and we do that. The other thing that's important is this. There was a woman who bought a $400,000 condominium. She moved in. Her mother came to visit her. Her mother was in a wheelchair. Her mother could not, in her wheelchair, get into any of the 3 bathrooms that were in that condominium. The condominium happened to be built in a building with 3 others. And the Fair Housing Act design and construction requirements say this: when you have units in a building with 4 or more units, you must have 7 design and construction features. One of them being a person should be able to get into a bathroom in the wheelchair, close the door for privacy, okay, be able to get to all of the machinery that's in the bathroom and be able to, exit, with no problem. They should be able to get into a kitchen and be able to do a 360, because the fire marshal certainly doesn't want people in wheelchairs backing up to try to get out of a house on fire. Okay, so there are things like that. So they called their realtor called us, we called the contractor, and after an investigation, we got the contractor to fix that at their cost, okay, and that because it was their obligation. What is problematic is this: your developers and your contractors, your local business people, can get an occupancy permit or a building permit without the building inspectors ever looking at the federal fair housing design and construction requirements. And unless the local building inspector, gets online and prints out a sheet and hands it to people, a lot of them just don't know. We look at the Green out in Greene County. After they built those first apartments, they had to end up suing their architectural firm out of Texas, who had to cough up $2.5 million in retrofits because the building was, all of those apartments were so built out of compliance. And so I don't know really what happens in this county, but I tell people about this, that a lot of people spring to action. And there's, if anybody ever needed, we have a single sheet of paper that we can email people, and they can hand that out that tells about those 7 design and construction features. And some jurisdictions just have a disclaimer when they give their building and occupancy permits and say, our review did not include this part. So, so those are some things that we see out there that, since I'm coming to talk to elected officials, and I know there's staff here, that I want to remind people about, and that we see our people are getting complaints filed against them, and we don't want that to happen here. Questions about the mission or what we do at the Fair Housing Center?
Back on the veterans, are you pushing or lobbying to be equal like the other ones?
We certainly are.
Okay.
We certainly are. We unfortunately, we've gone at it 3 different times, and each time the person who's presented our case has not gotten reelected the next time. So we've got to figure out who we can get up there that's going to be there for a while. But we will continue to work on getting that added to. It was just, we don't believe that anybody meant to do anything. They just, in 2008, when they added military status, it just didn't come to their mind. So I think that will eventually get solved.
Any other questions?
Just on the Troy City side, our representative for Fair Housing is Jill Myers with the County Development Department. Also, with it being April Fair Housing Month, we are distributing education materials to those companies that are partnering with us to provide the educational materials. And then also, we also provide educational material on our website as well with the City of Troy.
Yeah, Troy has always been a great partner. I've worked a long time with Nikki, and I enjoy the relationship we have here.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. Thank you, Jackie. Brings us to comments. Mayor Oda, do you have any comments tonight?
I do not.
Mr. Titterton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two comments. First of all, tomorrow night, just a reminder to council as well as the public, we are having the Streetscape Concepts Plan. Our consultant will be here. That's 6 o'clock at the Redmond building downtown on East Main Street. We'll be talking about some design options. So if you can be there to provide your input, that would be very helpful as they move forward to getting into detail and getting into some costs, cost estimates, et cetera. The other thing is that I've gotten a question or two about street sweeping. I guess a lot of people are driving up Experiment Farm Road, but we do have a piece of street sweeping equipment, sweeper that's out at the maintenance facility. Somebody thought that it was a brand new one. We have not purchased a brand new one. It was not in the budget. It is slightly over the $75,000 threshold. But I do want to remind, and I was asked to remind everybody that we do have and for several years have had a street sweeping contract. Normally, like this year, during the winter months, we don't use the contractor. They are here this week to street sweep the entire city. I believe they can do it in a week. I think the weather may not cooperate tomorrow, but they will do it until it gets done. We do that about every month or two, depending on the time of the year. We have found that given how finicky even newer street sweeping equipment can be, a contractor has worked well. I know in the past we've had some concerns about the quality of the street sweeping, particularly last year for some reason. So we did have a conversation, tightened up the contract specs. That is about $75,000 a year that comes into out of the stormwater improvement fund, and it is much more cost effective for us than purchasing a $400,000 to $500,000 street sweeper. We do have a street sweeper. It's an older unit that we use for cleanup, for utility repairs, that kind of work, or if there's a major accident or debris in the road. That's all I have. Thank you.
Mr. President?
Yes, ma'am.
Could I just confirm again the date and time of that Streetscape meeting? I want to make sure I heard it correctly.
6 p.m.
6 p.m. tomorrow at the Redmond.
It's Wednesday. It's
Wednesday. Yeah, Wednesday, not tomorrow. Wednesday.
Wednesday
I
the
said tomorrow.
17th.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay, that's why I wanted to
Correct.
confirm.
Sorry.
Wednesday the 17th.
Wednesday.
That's it.
You can show up on Tuesday. I'm sure they'd welcome you, but the meeting.
Probably give you an application
Thank
and
you.
everything.
Yeah, give you a free beer,
I'll do that later. Law Director, Mr. Kerber.
Mr. President, I have no comments this evening.
City Auditor, Mr. Frigge.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have nothing at this time.
My only comment is, if we could keep Mr. Twist in our thoughts and prayers from the unexpected loss of his father this past week. And I'm sure it's been there. There's a lot of things to deal with. So, council members, comments.
I have a comment, Mr. President. Our community is blessed with a number of philanthropic and nonprofit organizations, but really the heart and the bloodline for a number of those is the Troy Foundation. And today they kicked off what will be an annual celebration. There was a ribbon cutting and an event tonight, but they are celebrating 100 years. I heard today that they have $140 million, and more importantly, they've put $130 million back into this community, and I just wanted to applaud them for that, and I know council has a great working relationship with them, as does the city, but there'll be a number of events throughout the year, but they did kick off their 100th anniversary today.
Thank you. Anyone else? Staff.
Members of the audience?
Good evening. Ben Southerly, President of the Troy Historic Preservation Alliance, 110.5 West Main Street, Troy. Hopefully this will be my next to last update to you all. We are currently 15 days out from deadline on the stabilization repair project at 112 118 West Main Street. This is the last City Council meeting prior to the April 30th deadline, and I see no reason why West Main Street would not be reopened the next time I come before Council in early May. All stabilization repairs should be complete by this Friday, April 19th. As promised in our last update, the scaffolding in front of the IOF building came down this past week, and the scaffolding around the old Miami County Courthouse began coming down today. So what work remains? Not much. This week, Level MB Construction is filling in the coal chute in the basement of the building. All trim, gutters, and downspouts are scheduled to be finished no later than tomorrow. Carey Company, our roofing subcontractor, will be patching the roof of the one-story addition on the west side of the old courthouse, and then we will be re-roofing the section. We will re-roof that section of roofing once the scaffolding comes off, and we are working on re-roofing the one-story addition on the east side of the old courthouse as well. As we prepare for the reopening of West Main Street, we want to ensure the safety of pedestrians on the sidewalk. We will be temporarily, and I'll underscore temporarily, placing plywood coverings over the larger windows of the IOF building along West Main Street. These plywood coverings will be painted and will only be in place for a few months until the windows are either restored or replaced. We have applied to the National Trust for a grant that would fund restoration of the windows, and we expect a decision on that grant in June. Weather permitting, the Troy Historic Preservation Alliance plans to have volunteers out cleaning the street in front of the building this coming Wednesday in preparation for its reopening. From a fundraising standpoint, I'm pleased to share that $816,184 has been pledged toward the project, and we have an additional $50,000 in private loans arranged if necessary. Of the more than $816,000 pledged, $773,844 has been collected. We have truly been blown away by the generous support of 309 donors, with 56 additional donors just since my last update. On Thursday, April 25th, we would like to invite all of you to the latest event in our Dine to Donate series at Crafted and Cured. 25% of all proceeds will go towards stabilization repairs of the IOF building, Old Miami County Courthouse.
Ben, can you say that date again? I didn't hear it.
Thursday, April 25th.
April 25th.
And that'll be from, I think, 3 p.m. to 10 p.m. are their hours that day. About 500 of the 536 bricks used to repair the parapet on the IOF building have been sponsored. So we have about 40 bricks still available. Folks can sponsor a brick for $100 through our website, www.thpatroy.org. It has been 25 days since the city's administration last updated the community about the status of the West Main Street closure. The THPA asked several questions at the last City Council meeting and never received a response. However, Mr. Titterington apparently sent an email to certain city officials along with an admonishment not to respond to the email in writing, but instead to call him on his cell phone with any questions or concerns. THPA only learned about this email because it was apparently leaked. It was disappointing to receive no response to our questions from the city administration, as transparency during the stabilization repair phase of this project ought to be in both directions. This evening, as we approach the April 30th deadline, THPA's only request is that the city administration honor the good faith clause of the settlement agreement. THPA has been honest and transparent with the city about its progress. THPA's actions and those of its contractors speak for themselves and have been for the benefit of downtown Troy. We believe that when the acting chief building official inspects the building, You will find that all items listed in Exhibit B of the settlement agreement as needing repair will have been fully addressed. If the city administration feels there's any red tape that needs to be addressed beyond the Exhibit B list in the settlement agreement, I would ask that the city be transparent and forthright about those items and that it not spring any requirements on THPA at the 11th hour so that West Main Street can be reopened as quickly as possible. Are there any questions that I can help answer?
Mr. Schultz?
Yes.
Mr. Sutherland, I had a question on, you talked about the window restoration,
Yes.
and as I looked at the building, it's beginning to look very, very nice, by the way. And but I was wondering, when you talk about the restoration, when you're looking at the building on the right-hand side, you got these big plate glass windows. Would those be restored to the way the windows look on the left-hand side of the building, or re-bricking?
Facing West Main Street?
Yeah, facing West Main Street. Are those, I mean, when you're talking about restoration, would you go back and put windows that are like are on the left side of the building and remove those plate glass, or has anybody thought about that? I mean, is that?
So,
I mean, that's the way the building was probably built originally, I guess.
Yeah. So if we get the funding from the National Trust, there would be an expectation that we would restore the windows. And then along with that, then you'd probably have to look at maybe some kind of a storm window that would potentially go with that.
Mm-hmm.
Those particulars will have to be approved by the Planning Commission as well.
Sure.
But I don't, to be honest with you, I guess I haven't noticed a difference between the windows on one side versus the other. Many of the windows across the north facade, north elevation are very old windows, and just judging by the waviness of the glass, probably a lot of those windows are original to when it was built in 1902. We will have to gauge that, but if we get the grant dollars, we will have to abide by the National Trust guidelines for that.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you, Mr. Sutherland.
Thank you.
Anyone else would like to address council? If not, we're adjourned. May 8th will be the next meeting. Thank you.